Histories. I'm your host, Bobby Morrison. On this show, I look at a supposedly haunted place in the Durham region. I will tell you all a brief history of said location, as well as the land it resides on, and the ghostly legends attached to it. For myself, I am a believer in the paranormal, but I will leave it up to you, the listener. This show is meant more to be educational than just a ghost show. Listen to the stories, the history, and the tales of the land, and decide for yourself. To begin today, this show is a mini-series. I will look at haunted places in Whitby and Oshawa, hopefully interview some more interesting people, and listen to their fantastical tales of the supernatural. If this show is enjoyed, I may continue it. With that being said, today I will be looking at the Lynde House in Whitby, Ontario. I will tell you everything I could find about the house, from when it was built to the people who live there, as well as a very special interview with Lisa Johnson. She's the museum manager of the Lynde House and works for the Whitby Historical Society. I talked with her about the house, as well as the many factors that could have impacted the stories of ghostly apparitions. The house is a two-story home, which is currently yellow in color with green window shutters. The house was built by the Lyndes, who were some of the first settlers to Whitby. The house was technically the second Lynde house, with the family first building a log cabin in the early 1800s, and then in 1811 the Lynde house was completed. Unfortunately, in the 1960s, the log cabin, which like the Lynde house had been turned into apartments, burned down. According to Lisa Johnson, they, the Historical Society, think it may have been a kitchen fire. Nonetheless, the Lynde house is the only thing that survived. The house originally resided at 960 Dundas Street West, where the Queen's Commons strip mall exists now, by the White Oaks apartment buildings complex. The house was moved to the old Cullen Gardens at 300 Taunton Road West in 1986. For those who don't know, Cullen Gardens was an attraction which had a miniature animatronic village and hiking trails. Though Lisa told me, and you will all hear in the interview later, some people found it creepy, but personally I enjoyed the animatronic village. The house remained here until the gardens closed, and in 2013, the house made a 6.1 kilometer trek to its now permanent location at 900 Brock Street South. The house's last journey was especially iconic because it made its way down the historic Brock Street, where many Whitby events took place, onto the land in the area. The house now resides right beside the Whitby Historical Society. These two properties are situated facing east. To the left of them is residential houses, and to the right is the Rotary Centennial Park. The entire town of Whitby resides on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas, which is a branch of the Anishinaabe Nation. This nation is the Ojibwe peoples, or a part of the Ojibwe peoples, who have been around for thousands of years, longer than the country of Canada or even the town of Whitby. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, in the 17th century or the 1600s, the Ojibwe peoples began moving from the Great Lakes towards southern Ontario and into the United States, arriving in parts of Minnesota. Though during this time there isn't any information available I could find if skirmishes took place near the Lynde House or even near the town, or what would soon be the Lynde House and the town. Something of note is that the Lyndes and other influential families of Whitby were in the area before Whitby was even a town. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia's page on the town of Whitby, the area the town resides on was first called Perry's Corner, after a man named Peter Perry, who, like the Lyndes, was an influential settler in the early Whitby days. The town was then, when it came to be, was called Windsor, before being changed to Whitby, because there is an English port town in the United Kingdom called Whitby. The house itself wasn't completed until 1811, while the town would not come to be until 1855, and then Canada as a country itself in 1867. This makes the lands of all locations of the Lynde House very old. There is also the fact that the Lyndes opened their doors to British soldiers for the War of 1812, but I'll get into that more later. Although not in the direct vicinity, the town of Whitby and the village of Brooklyn have had a lot of events occur in their long histories. A Whitby historian by the name of Brian Winters wrote a book called Whitby Chronicles of a County Town, which has a lot of the area's history in it. A quick side note for all those listening, I highly recommend this book, especially even if you don't live in Whitby, you just like history, or you live in Whitby and you like the town's history, it's a great book and it's an interesting read. One major event was on the iconic Brock Street back in 1901, almost over 100 years after the family first arrived. The event was the Gross and Granger Fire. While Brock Street was prone to many fires because most buildings were made out of wood, this one was especially notable. Both noted by a plaque on Brock Street near the original Gross and Granger hardware store and the book by Brian Winters, the fire happened one morning in the hardware store when it's believed a person accidentally knocked over a kerosene lantern. This lantern exploded into a fireball that quickly consumed the three-story building. What made this event notable is the fact that the hardware store had live rounds of ammunition. Until 1995, there was no gun control in Canada. When the fire reached the live ammo, the rounds exploded like popcorn in a microwave, and no one could get close to the fire for a reported half an hour. Several citizens, including a priest, were wounded by the flying bullets. Luckily, nothing serious. The Whitby Fire Company and the Oshawa Fire Company were trapped from stopping the fire because of the bullets. Once the bullets stopped, there truly wasn't anything to save. The next year, the corpse of the building collapsed, bringing two wooden building stores with it. Although at this time the Lynde House was still by what is now the White Oaks apartment complex, the fire was devastating to the town. As noted again in Winter's book, Whitby has had many vicious fires and criminal elements, with the town previously having a courthouse, which is not now the Whitby Courthouse Theater, with a jail in the basement, which I will be talking about on another show. Though much of the areas where the Lynde House has sat has not seen any major events, the original location of what is now essentially the White Oaks Apartments was farmland for much of its time, with only the last 30 to 40 years being developed. As Lisa will explain later in her interview, the only reason the house was moved to Cullen Gardens in the first place was because land developers wanted to shift the farmland into residential areas and a strip mall, and also the fact that the original owner of the Cullen Gardens invested money into the restoration of the house to its almost original look. But the land of which the gardens sat on is farmland too. The area of the village of Brooklyn and the area of the gardens for many years was empty land, or as I said, farmland. I used to live in Brooklyn, and most of that town was farmland when I was a kid. Only until recently, in the past decade, has the village exploded into the massive multi-million-dollar houses area. There's only truly one farm left in that town, with the rest being turned into bridges or the 407 highways or so on. My parents even told me when they first moved to the area of Whitby in the early 2000s, the Smart Center with the Walmart right by the old Cullen Gardens wasn't even there, just a patch of empty land. Most of the houses, extensive neighborhoods, the McKinney Center, the retirement home, all empty land for some time. For some, ghostly hauntings happen when areas of land are exposed to major events. Funny enough, though, the area the house has sat on in its history, all locations, by the way, has sort of stayed out of major Whitby events, unlike that of the War of 1812. That could mean that the owners of the land could have experienced events of their own, leading to mysterious stories and hauntings. Now I shall look at the Lynde family, who the original Lyndes were, and what they did for the town. Then you shall hear from Lisa Johnson, who herself is not a ghost believer, but has had some experiences that cannot be explained. Now, who are the Lyndes? The original Lyndes were some of the first settlers to the town of Whitby, but I say are because the Lyndes are still around. The family has had many descendants, many of which are still in the area and in the Durham region. The first Lynde to enter Canada was Jabez Lynde. I apologize if I am saying that wrong. He was an American from Massachusetts who, with his father-in-law, a man named Hawkins Woodruff, traveled from the States to what is now Whitby in the early 1800s. His wife, Clarissa Woodruff Lynde, then left Massachusetts and joined her husband in the early 1800s as well. She arrived around 1803. Jabez was born in 1773 and lived until 1856, making him 83 years old at the time of his passing, which is pretty impressive, given that, as we know in history, most settlers made it just long enough to have children, and then that was it. His wife, Clarissa, was born 1 year after Jabez in 1774. Sadly, she would only live until 1830, making her 56 when she passed. Jabez stayed loyal to the British during the War of 1812. Being a loyalist, he served in the militia against American soldiers. The Lyndes also helped transform their home for the British, loyalists, and indigenous soldiers during the war, making it a tavern, a hospital, and a hotel or an inn. The house served as a way point for militia and soldiers to secure supplies on their way to or back to battle. The wounded also arrived at the Lynde House, where two doctors by the names of Dr. Lee and Dr. Powell served. So while no major battles took place, the home helped those defending the British colonies from the Americans. A visitor to the Lynde House during this time wasn't uncommon, but an important one was General Sir Isaac Brock, who was the mascot for Brock University. Brock was a military strategist who died defending Niagara from the Americans on October 13, 1812. He was 43. According to Brock University's website, his last word was in Latin. It was Surgite, or Surgite, which means push on. Clarissa Lynde also helped with the war effort. She got neighboring women to help cook and nurse those injured. She also kept a garden, which is still maintained today, although at the new Lynde House location. She also had farm animals and a chicken to keep her family and visitors fed. Jabez would survive the war, and like many who served in the war, returned home, and home was Whitby, to raise children and grow old knowing they had defeated the Americans and their loyalty to the British was secured. The Lynde couple, from a quote from the Lynde House Museum website, quote, wanted to create a culture of education, industriousness, which means to create industries, and entrepreneurial spirit. And in a sense, they did create a culture of education with their home and history educating the public. The Lynde couple would raise 8 children. These children were Sylvester, Hawkins, Clarissa, Louisa, Carlton, Armida, Warren, and Almina Lynde. All of these kids would live with the family in the house until 1893. As I learned from Lisa, and you'll hear, the reason the Lyndes left is because Almina Lynde passed and had left the house to All Saints Church, which surprised the entire family because she had nieces and nephews who presumably would have liked to keep the house in the family name, but were unable to. Now the house is changing owners. I couldn't find what All Saints used the Lynde House for, but I would assume it was church needs. For a short period, the church owned the property before selling it to Pickering Farms. Pickering Farms was, as Lisa described it, a large commercial enterprise farming company that employed a lot of workers. The company turned the house and previous log cabin into apartments for the workers and their families. It is believed this is how the log cabin burned down, via a worker having a kitchen fire. This is something that happened a lot with old Whitby buildings. As time progresses, we try to modernize these buildings, but forget that since they are old, they have many faults. A sad fire like this occurred again in 2015 in the downtown Brock Street area. An old building converted into apartments had a massive fire and ended up collapsing. 121 Brock Street burned to the ground. The 130-year-old building, which was built in the late 1880s, is gone. And by gone, I mean they never rebuilt it. There's still tarp on the sides of the adjoining buildings to where it used to be. After the house was acquired as a museum in the 1970s, it was divided up into sections as apartments. Oh, sorry, my mistake. This is my mistake. The house was still divided up into sections of apartments, but when they acquired it as a museum, they changed it back. The museum has been set up to have a lived-in feel, so to some it's like the Lyndes never left, and maybe they didn't. And now for the hauntings, I talked to Lisa Johnson about the hauntings, but for me personally, I have been inside the house. I mentioned it in this interview, but the house just feels like an old house to me. Even though I believe in the paranormal, it feels like an old Whitby house. I've lived in a lot of old houses, I would say. 3 to be exact. That would be, actually not 3. That was my bad. 2. Which was one in the Dovedale Drive area of Whitby, and my current home. The Dovedale Drive house was built in the 40s to withstand bombs, so the walls were made of plaster. But I've lived in a lot of old houses, and the Lynde House just feels like an old house. It has the lived in feel. It has the stuff that the Lyndes would have used while they lived in the house. But it personally, to me, just feels like an old house. But now on Haunted Histories, my very special interview with Lisa. I asked her about possible reason for the hauntings, what could cause it, and she has given me some of the tales. Without further ado, here is my interview with Lynde House Museum Manager Lisa Johnson. Now, I just want to thank you for joining me today. It's very kind of you. So my podcast is called Haunted Histories. So I'll be taking a look at different histories around the Durham region and such. And I want to just ask you a few questions about the Lynde House, if that's all right with you.
Sure. Okay.
So I want to ask, do you believe in ghosts?
Not personally.
Okay.
I have never had an experience with that. No, I don't.
All right. I just want to ask because that's a part of the show is just to ask that sort of stuff.
Yeah, of course.
Because you've never had any experiences, do you think there's anything going on inside the house, or do you think it's just an old house?
Well, you see, it's interesting. There's been an awful lot of stories. So there's been awful lot of personal experiences other people have had, including my husband. And so I don't know. It's very interesting to me. But I have yet to find proof.
Yeah, I've been in the house myself, and it kind of just feels like an old Whitby house. Do you think that's maybe where the stories come from? Because it's just an old house, so people want there to be more.
I don't know, because people have been very, very adamant that they saw what they saw or they heard what they heard. So now the interesting thing about our ghosts are that they're all very friendly. Whatever the sightings have been, whatever the sounds have been, it's always been friendly and happy. So maybe there are happy ghosts living in the house. I don't know.
So I just wanted to ask, because I've read a lot about the Lynde House and stuff. So the house has been moved 2 times. How did that all work out?
It was a big undertaking. I lived in Whitby, but I was not personally here working at the museum for either time. The first time it was moved, the original location was at corner of Dundas and McQuay, which is where the Queen's Common Plaza is now. And it was moved in 1986 because that plaza was going to be built, and it got moved to Cullen Gardens up on Taunton Road. And it stayed at Cullen Gardens. It was a good thing that it got moved there, because Len Cullen invested $2 million into the restoration of the house to bring it back to the condition it was originally in, to look like it did originally. And then it stayed there for a very long time. At the time, I don't excuse me, I don't know if you're old enough to, did you ever visit Cullen Gardens?
Yes.
As a child? Yes. Okay. All right. So I don't know if you remember the little animatronics that Len Cullen had in the house. And I think sometimes some people's ideas that the house is haunted is because they were a little bit afraid of those animatronics. So that led to some of the stories. But yeah, so in Cullen Gardens closed, and then in 2013 the house was moved here to its current permanent location. It became owned by the town of Whitby. It was no longer privately owned, and it is operated by the Whitby Historical Society now. So it's in its permanent location now.
Well, that's great. I just wanted to also ask, other than the Lyndes, who lived in the house? Do you happen to know? Or
so the Lynde family lived in the house from around 1812 to 1893, when Elmina Lynde passed away. She was daughter of the original family who had inherited the house. In 1893, when she passed away, she surprised the entire family by leaving the house to her church, All Saints. And she had 52 nieces and nephews, so it came as a big surprise. All Saints owned it for a short time. They sold it. Um, then it eventually ended up in possession of Pickering Farms, and Pickering Farms was a large commercial farming enterprise, and they hired a lot of workers, and they converted the house into apartments for those workers. So when the house became a museum originally in 1970s, it was divided into the apartments. And I've actually met people who lived in the apartments as children because their parents worked at the farm. So it's quite interesting to think about that and think about entire family living in 2 rooms of the house.
Yeah.
So, but that's there also used to be a log house, the original. So when the Lynde family first moved here, they built a log house, as most settlers did, and then they built this house in front of the log house. So this was attached. Log house used to be attached to the back. Unfortunately, in 1969, there was a fire and we lost the log house. So, yeah, it was one of the apartments at the time, and so I believe it was a kitchen fire in the apartment. So that was what happened. So unfortunately, that piece is no longer with us.
That's kind of disappointing, but
Yeah.
so there's been a lot of people who lived in the house. Could that have also attributed to the stories? Just people living in an old house, you know?
Possible. I don't see why not. Most of the sightings that people have had, they have claimed everybody is in the big old-fashioned Victorian dresses. And so I think what they're seeing goes back further than that. But I don't know. um, would you like to hear some stories, or is that later?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, so the one that has always got my attention and made me go about do I believe or not, is the fact that multiple people have come to the house at separate times on tours and said, do you have a ghost couple that stays at the top of the stairs, the stairs that by the front entrance?
Yeah.
And they say they're very happy, they're smiling down at us, I see them. And it's been numerous people on separate occasions have said the same thing, which leads me to go, that's a little bit weird.
Yeah.
Because they're not connected in any way. The other thing that several people have said is that they've been going up the stairs, and at the railing that runs along the side of the stairs upstairs, they see a big lady's skirt, with like the hoop skirt walking past, but as soon as they turn their head, they don't see anything there. So there's also been a cat that's supposedly run past that railing, and then they turn and they're like, where did the cat come from? And then it's gone. So apparently we have a ghost cat.
Great.
Yeah. The other situation, which was my husband volunteers here. He does a lot of the maintenance, and he was with another volunteer in the basement last year. They were working down there. They were working in the house alone. We were under lockdown at the time. They were just doing some maintenance, and they heard the voice from upstairs calling, "Hello," and it was a woman's voice. And they thought it was me, that I'd come over to tell them something. So they called back to me, and I never answered. So they came upstairs to see if I needed help with something, and I wasn't there. I was over in the gift shop. I was in the office.
Oh, geez.
And the door was locked from inside, so it's not, nobody wandered in off the street.
Yeah.
So to this day, they don't know who yelled hello down. So, yes, it's a little bit odd. They actually, another interesting story about a strange phenomenon which happened when they were in the basement. They were doing some work, and they got some pieces of wood, and they were building something down there. And the other volunteer, Rick, he flipped over one of the pieces of wood, and he laughed. He said, "Hey, look, this one has my birthday written on it." Well, the year. It had the year written on it. And they were like, "Oh, that's funny. What a coincidence." And so they turned over another piece of wood. And it had my husband's birth year written on it. No other piece of wood in the wood had anything written on them. So they did find that very freaky.
Yeah,
So those are.
Sorry.
No, I'm just saying those are some of the stories that have to do with the house.
It's very interesting because I've lived in a lot of old houses, and I've been in the Lynde House before, and the first thing I really noticed when I was in there is how thin the walls are because you can hear the cars outside on the street.
Yes.
And I was thinking, oh, maybe that's why people think they hear these things because they see the cars. The only thing I felt when I was in the house was it was like I was being watched. But then
Okay.
again, I've been in a lot of old houses, so it's like that sort of feeling. But no, it's always an interesting house because you see it on the street and you're like, oh, I wonder who lives there. And they're like, no, no one lives there. It's a museum. And you're like, oh, okay, I thought someone lived there. So,
I kind of live there.
yeah, your workplace becomes your home after a while.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And I have to say, I've always felt like it's a home.
Yeah,
it feels like a home to me. Like it's a very comfortable place to be.
oh yeah.
You know, it feels happy.
It's a nice place because like for the Pickering Museum, I've been there when I was in school and stuff. You can tell that the buildings aren't really real. They kind of feel, like a sort of like a set. And then you go into this house and it feels more like it's there, like.
We do try and make it appear as it would have when the family lived in there. I mean, the buildings at Pickering Village are real. They are real houses that were moved, maybe just used in a different way.
Yeah.
And so because of the way we try to exhibit the house, it does have that sort of lived in feel. And we do try and change up certain things, kind of like the way the family would. We put new quilts on the beds every once in a while. It also helps to rotate the linens so you don't fade anything and so forth. So new quilts on the bed, different plates on the table, change it up for the holidays. So it does give that lived in.
Oh well, that's great. Before we wrap, I just want to say again thank you for joining me today.
No problem.
I just had one last question. Do the Lyndes have any living relatives left around, or
the Lyndes have a lot of living relatives around? Actually, you have to remember the original family had 8 children. From those 8 children came 52 grandchildren, and of those 52 grandchildren, on average, they had at least 3 to 4 children each. Some a lot more.
Wow. Okay.
So there are a lot of descendants. Most of them are in the 5th or 6th, and we even go down to the 8th generation now. They're spread out all around the place. The oldest known living relative at the moment turned 100 last year, and that was Grace Lynde Hopkins. And so we actually had the pleasure of having her visit the museum for her birthday, and she came to visit us, and a large group of her family came to visit in the park outdoors behind the museum. They had a picnic out there to celebrate her birthday, and there was probably over 100 family members who came throughout the afternoon. So it was quite amazing because it kind of makes you envision how it would have been when the whole original family was there with the parents and the kids and the grandkids and great grandkids at some point, and they would always have these big reunions. So it was real nice to see another big Lynde family reunion again.
Well, that's very awesome. Thank you very much again, Lisa, for joining me. I thank you for taking the time out of your day to speak to me about the Lynde House and the ghosts and stuff. And that was my interview with Lisa Johnson. So, what do you, the listener, think? Is the Lynde House haunted, or is it all a legend? And that has been episode 1 of Haunted Histories. Next week, the Canadian Automotive Museum, beautiful cars, and possible hauntings. All that and more on the next episode of Haunted Histories. I again wanted to thank Lisa Johnson for taking the time out of her day to speak to me about the Lynde House and the amazing museum that's there and the ghostly legends. I also wanted to tell everyone, you, the listeners, and everyone else listening, that I have created a works cited for all the resources that I have used to do research on this piece in the description of this video. If you want, you can follow me on Twitter at JediBo_29. I do Riot Radio news updates from my Riot Radio show on there at Durham College, or there will be updates about this show on that Twitter. Thank you all for listening, and have a great night.